Well, I've been watching your podcast here and there, and frankly, it's kind of become one of my favorite ones, I have to confess. And of course, this is triggernometry, so to speak. You also describe yourself as a clown world skeptic. So I thought, why don't we start there? What does that mean exactly?
Well, clown world is an internet meme, which is basically to say that the world we now live in increasingly makes no sense. The things that we're being told, we're supposed to believe, the things that you are being fed by the mainstream media every day, not only don't make sense, but are quite often contradictory to each other. So, for example, one of the things that we now are repeatedly told is you are supposed to, the moment anyone identifies as anything, you're supposed to accept that. Yet people will often criticize me. I used to be a comedian. Now my main focus is on the show Trigonometry. And those very same people who spend their entire lives talking about how we must allow people to identify as what they identify and respect that, they will then say, well, just because Konstantin identifies as a comedian doesn't mean he's a comedian, which is, if you think about it, an incredibly transphobic thing to say, right? So the point is that a lot of the modern beliefs that in society you're required to have if you want to have a mainstream career, if you don't want to be kicked out of your job, if you don't want to never appear on television again, all of these things, the things you have to publicly believe, A, don't make sense, and B, are quite often contradictory to the same beliefs that these people hold in other areas. So, for example, give you a less personal and more broad example, there are people who argue and support the idea of open borders. These are simultaneously the very people who believe in a huge welfare state. Now, these two things are completely incompatible and they don't work together, but that doesn't deter these people from having those beliefs. And we could spend the whole hour just talking about examples of this clown world that I talk about. So I'm very skeptical about the idea of clown world, and I'm skeptical about living in it.
So this actually speaks to, this viral thread that you had on Twitter a little while ago. Why don't they believe us? It was later turned into a tablet piece. I thought it was very apropos, and it was also interesting that it's something that is international. Like here in the US, where I'm based right now, I'm Canadian, as many of our viewers know, so I'm also looking at all this a bit from the outside. But there's very much this sort of, as you describe, clown world reality. That's very, very interestingly juxtaposed to this idea of, I guess, vaccine skepticism or vaccine mandate skepticism, at least, or frankly, general skepticism. And you put together a very, very interesting kind of breakdown, or why people might not be so ready to accept, whatever the edicts are from on high these days.
Well, that article, and it was based on a Twitter thread, as you say, it essentially details the events of the last 5 years and how consistently on a whole host of issues, whether it was Trump, whether it was Brexit, whether it was Black Lives Matter and the ensuing conversation about race and discrimination, whether it's then the pandemic, on all of those issues, the experts, the so-called experts, the people who are responsible for telling us what's true, that is often the media, it's pollsters, it's political commentators, it's all the people that we are given and that are held up for us to trust and respect and believe. They have all consistently shown us that they're not to be trusted. It started with Brexit, first of all. And by the way, I don't say this as in any party political way. I voted Remain in that referendum in the UK. We were told it would never happen. We were told that all the polls show that it's not going to happen. We were told that all the people that are going to vote for Brexit are this tiny minority of evil, bigoted racists. And then, boom, we wake up and 52% of the country voted to leave the EU. Donald Trump followed shortly afterwards. Again, some publications had him losing with a 99% certainty, etc. Right, and then boom, we wake up and this person who we're told is, a white nationalist who no one in their right mind would support. Turns out, actually, people voted for him and he was elected. On and on we go. We had the whole Russia collusion, and I'm someone who is from Russia, and I have no doubt that the Russian government is always attempting to interfere in elections all over the world. But it didn't seem to me a credible explanation for what happened. And as we later saw, all of the people who ran with that narrative later essentially stopped talking about it or had to backtrack because it turned out it wasn't actually true. The Russians didn't get Donald Trump elected. They didn't get Brexit done, which was one of the other allegations that we were exposed to. Then you go to the race issue, which has been hyped up so much in the last few years, and there's numerous examples, whether it's Juicy Smouye, as Dave Chappelle famously called him, lying, but the media running with the story, right? People are going to lie about all sorts of things all the time. It was the fact that the media ran with it that was so insulting. And of course, then you had the pandemic plus the race issue, where we all spent, certainly in this country, months in lockdown. We were told that if we go out, we're spreading a deadly virus, we're killing granny, etc. Boom, the moment BLM riots and protests happen, suddenly the same doctors write pieces in Time magazine, which I quoted in my article, saying actually protests are an important public health intervention. Right. So the moment something becomes progressive, it becomes true, whereas 2 days ago it was completely untrue. And on and on and on and on we go. And I gave a very long list of these explanations. Obviously, masks, we were told that they don't work, but also they don't work. But the reason that you shouldn't get one is that health workers need one. So it doesn't work, but health workers need one, so you shouldn't get one. And then they do work. And then it's the same thing with vaccines. We need to just give it to the vulnerable. And suddenly now we're talking about vaccine passports, one of the biggest violations of people's natural or God-given rights, whichever your view of that issue is, probably in modern Western history, right? Wherever you look, these people continue to discredit themselves on every issue. Is it any surprise then that when these very people who've been banging on about Russian collusion and Brexit and Trump that were never going to happen and all of that, when they say you must get the vaccine, a lot of people are like, whoa, you've been lying to me for 5 years. Why would I? People are hesitant. Now, my personal view on the vaccine is, I think if you're elderly and vulnerable in other ways, I personally think you should take it. Now, it's your decision. Everybody's body is their own body to do with what they want to do with it. And I think for younger people, the risk calculation is different and they should make their own decision about that, right? So I'm not someone who's anti-vax in any way. Both my parents are scientists. My dad actually made vaccines for the Soviet Union. That was his job. So I'm fully aware of the science of these things. I just think people have a right to make their own decision, and they should be free to do so on the basis of accurate information, not conjecture, not speculation, and certainly not coercion, which is what we're now seeing.
One of the things that strikes me is that whenever there's this sort of pervasive lying, I don't usually say it, but you're right. Pervasive lying or mistruths or changing of the truth, casually, and people start wondering what is actually true. Can we really trust anything? And that's actually fuels the creation of all sorts of these crazy conspiracy theories, right? And I find this actually the most disturbing because it's like not sort of having this commitment, to, especially for the scientific community, to promote, the best they can of truthful information each time and share that, kind of creates this whole ecosystem, it seems to me at least, of all sorts of crazy conspiracy stuff. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you completely. I think we should be aware as well that conspiracy theories have always existed. I think the reason that it's an issue that's coming to the fore at the moment is the technological progress that has happened, particularly in the last 10 years. If you think about the fact we only very recently commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there were huge numbers of conspiracies about that particular event. And it never occurred to anyone that they should be censored. That was never a conversation we were having at that time. It was never a conversation that was had 10 years, 20 years. Even now, we don't censor conspiracy theories about 9/11 at all. And yet, for some reason, it has now become very fashionable to talk about censoring all sorts of other stuff that is conspiracy that, I'm not someone who really believes any of these conspiracy theories, but I think the reason we've become so obsessed with them and trying to clamp down on them is the power of modern technology and the ability to spread information so virally as we now can.
Well, the lab origin as a possibility of the coronavirus is one of these conspiracy theories, or at least so we were told.
Not anymore, right? Now, most sensible people seem to accept that is probably where the virus came from. And I think, Jan, you point out such an important issue, which is the reason that I mentioned my parents. Both my parents are biochemical engineers. They're highly trained scientists in the Soviet Union. And this is what they always inculcated in me, the idea that there is a scientific consensus about some issue. Yeah, sure, there are times when most scientists agree about a particular issue, but the process of science is one of constant questioning and inquiry and skepticism. And in my house, as I say, my parents were both scientists. We had all sorts of books about all sorts of crazy notions and ideas that my parents would read, and they would read them skeptically and critically. And they would say, look, Konstantin, you must read this book. You got to remember, you've got to apply your own critical thinking to this. And let's have a conversation around the dinner table about the strengths and flaws in this argument.